You seem pretty excited when you show up for the newscast, Jacob, but I don't think I like what you're going to talk about today. Something about frost.
For winter lovers, it's the best time of the year.
La, 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 la. Not me. You're not talking to me on this one.
But yeah, we're probably going to have to break out those jackets as we go later in the week. With our first frosts and freezes on the way, good idea to talk about the science behind them this week. And first, let's start with some climatology. The first frost usually happens back in September, the middle of the month, when the temperature is below 36 degrees. Now, frost isn't technically when that temperature is below 36. It's just the conditions become more ideal once our temperatures are below 36 degrees, and you have to observe that frost on a surface. So the records for this aren't exact, but you can see our latest temperature getting below 36 degrees on record in our climate sites is in early or middle of October. Now, the reason why frost can form when the temperature is 36 degrees, as warm as that, is because the temperature at the ground can still be at 32, at that freezing mark. Now, our normal air temperature that you see us show on TV, or that you might see observed at weather recording sites across the region, is actually measured a couple of feet above the ground. So that's why if the temperature is 36 degrees, at the ground itself, the ground temperature could be 32. Now, it's important what the surface temperature is, because that's what dictates if there's going to be frost that forms. And of course, with the more dense air sinking, that's why we can have that cooler temperature right near the ground and have that difference in temperature just at over a few feet. Now, there's water molecules in the air, and the more water vapor, the more humidity that we have in the air, the more likely that there is for a frost to form, because frost is just frozen dew. When the dew point and the temperature meet, you can get dew to form on grass or any frozen surfaces. So when those water molecules in the air touch the frozen surface, they freeze to form those ice crystals, or what we call frost. Now, you need favorable conditions near clear skies, and that's how we can get what's called radiation frost, when you have the warm air from the day escaping out into space, and that allows for our temperatures to really plummet close to the ground and frost to form. You need light winds. If there's very strong winds, that doesn't allow for our water vapor molecules to condense and freeze on surfaces. Having a good amount of moisture in the air, because if the air is very dry, there's not a lot of water molecules in the air to condense and freeze on a surface. So if you want to figure out if there's going to be frost, look at the relative humidity. If that relative humidity percentage is rather high, that means your dew point and your temperature are rather close to each other. There's a decent amount of moisture in the air to therefore condense and freeze on a surface. And of course, those temperatures in the 30s with moisture on the ground too help. So if there's a recent rain, that can help to form some frost on surfaces. Our average first frost date across the country, of course, it's a lot earlier in the year for the mountains and for the northern plains. Our average first frost date, as we went over, was in the middle of, or average first freeze date, excuse me, that's what that graphic was for, is in the middle to end of September. So it's still later than normal for this time of year for seeing our first freeze, but not into the records. The latest first freeze on record would be towards the middle to end of October. And it's important to keep these climatological records so that farmers and people that have gardens know when to expect those first freezes and even anticipate ones that occur earlier than normal. But what's happening over years in our climate is that our first frost is coming later. In Bismarck, it's actually 9 days later now than it was about 50 years ago. And we can see that that's increasing our growing season. So if you go back between 1895 and 2020, the length of our growing season across the country, but especially in parts of the north and west, are increasing. So that means that our last frost is occurring earlier in the spring, and our first frost is occurring later in the fall, expanding that growing season, expanding the window of opportunity when our crops can grow. So the impact that these frosts can have on our plants and crops, they're sensitive to freezing conditions. They'll stop their production at less than 32 degrees. Some plants are able to withstand that brief period when temperatures are below freezing, but most plants won't survive once temperatures are below 28 degrees. That's often referred to as a killing freeze, and our first killing freeze usually happens around early October. And that's important so that, let's take wheat for example. If wheat is at its most mature stage and a frost occurs, that can damage our crops and impact the yields, whereas if our first frost occurs later in the season, that will have less impacts on farmers. So if a frost occurs a lot earlier than we normally see, that can have a lot of negative impacts, because ice crystals form within plant tissues when temperatures are freezing outside. So that dehydrates the cells, disrupts disrupts or even ruptures the plant membranes and pretty much just causes physical damage within the cells, the plant cells themselves, the leaves, and they expand as those rigid ice crystals puncture the cells themselves, because ice expands from when water transforms to ice, it expands. So that basically ruptures the cells and causes a lot of damage within them. And that prevents any more photosynthesis occurring, prevents the plant from basically surviving anymore. So how can we protect our plants from having our frost outside if you still have something that's growing? Well, with covering them, breathable materials, sheets, blankets, towels, or something something that's made of fabric is important, because it acts like insulation. Having that warm ground radiate that heat helps to trap the heat around the plant. Plastic or tarps alone aren't the most effective because they're not breathable and the moisture can become trapped. You can also water the plant thoroughly beforehand because the wet soil retains the warmth better. Wrapping younger trees, removing covers after sunrise so that the heat just doesn't bake the plant essentially into the next day. And then bringing the plants that you can inside is also important. Frost on your windshield is also interesting because your car will initially be warmer than the surrounding air. Heat is quickly released through that pane of glass. There's nothing to insulate it. So the temperature of your windshield can drop below freezing a lot faster than other surroundings. And you need moisture in the air to condense and freeze. We talked about having some form of relative humidity percentage that's pretty high in order to form frost on your windshield. So using a frost cover, parking your car in the garage, or just under an awning can prevent the frost from forming on your windshields and having to scrape that car in the morning that we all don't want to spend the time on once we get into the winter months. So some interesting stuff about how frost impacts crops and how we can prepare for our first frosts and freezes of the season.
I know it's coming. I'm not ready.
And that's some good advice. I usually like to keep my car out during the warm season, but when we start to get our first frost and freeze,
in the garage.
Time to put it in the garage. Sounds good.